This is the moment out of both Avatar shows that I find myself thinking about most often. Throughout the past 55 episodes of the series, there's perhaps been nothing as consistent as Katara mentioning the fate of her mother, to the point where even the show will admit that it's more or less become her thing, and it's all led to this. No more blaming random Fire Nation citizens for what happened, as she's finally face to face with the man directly responsible for this defining trauma of her life. Except, unlike the last time they met, it's now up to her what happens next. We'll get back to this moment in a second, but let's travel back in time a bit to episode 10, where Katara meets a particular character. Jet is, by his own description, a freedom fighter, and one who feels more than comfortable to do whatever he deems necessary to anybody in his way for the sake of his people. And while the show doesn't exactly have a desire to discuss the morality of this, making Jet pretty obtusely evil in his conquest to flood an entire village, I do think his character is interesting in the sense that it first showcases the series attempting to draw a line of acceptability within the scope of its war. When Katara goes from being entirely smitten to entirely disgusted by Jet upon hearing of these plans, the show officially sets going on a violent rampage for revenge on the side of things that good guys just don't do. So, 2 seasons later, when Aang first learns of Zuko's plan to help Katara do exactly that, it makes sense that he, brings up Jet.
Maybe that's what he deserves. Katara, you sound like Jet.
Of course, though, it also makes sense that Katara immediately tries to make a distinction between the two.
It's not the same. Jet attacked the innocent. This man, he's a monster.
And it's not as if I'm sure that Katara is entirely wrong here or anything. I think I would agree that a mission to take out a pretty explicitly bad soldier isn't the same as blindly drowning a village, but that's hardly the argument that Katara will end up making here. Instead, after Aang and Sokka continue to press her about this, she eventually tells them that it really has nothing to do with the morality of the situation. Now that Zuko has told Katara that a confrontation with her mother's killer is on the table, how could she possibly think about anything else? A handful of episodes before this confrontation is the Puppet Master, which is actually structurally quite similar to Jet. The gang meets somebody resisting the Fire Nation, Sokka becomes suspicious, Katara becomes attached, they get separated, and then finally, Katara realizes and disapproves of the nature of their resistance. However, in comparison to Jet, which is a pretty cut and dry, wow, this guy kinda just sucks episode, the Puppet Master is a bit more complicated. Of course, not in the sense that Hama is any more of a morally great character, as kidnapping people under the mountain isn't exactly an arguable good, but the half hour is way more interested in how the character pulls this kidnapping off, bloodbending, and how Katara should feel after being essentially forced to learn it. The back half of this episode will try to somewhat verbalize why bloodbending is something that Katara is instantly upset by, with some prose about the immorality of taking control of somebody and forcing them to do things they don't want to do, but nothing is as convincing as just how evil this shit feels. I mean, it's called bloodbending, it looks like this, it's just clearly not something that somebody in the right would ever possibly do. In the span of a few episodes, Katara goes from sobbing at the idea that she once bloodbended when the alternative was watching her friends perish in front of her, to needlessly doing it to somebody who she only thinks killed her mother. Unlike Aang and Sokka, Zuko doesn't really have the relationship to say anything about this, leaving this moment mostly undiscussed. But it does pretty clearly mark this level of hypocrisy within Katara. Sure, Katara has now also blindly hurt others she didn't really know for revenge, and bloodbended those she only felt was responsible for her pain, but that's nothing like what Jet and Hama were doing. Right? The man that Katara bloodbended, the visibly evil leader of this visibly evil ship that's still committing evil acts, wasn't who she was looking for. Instead, the man who killed Katara's mother, the beast who caused the trauma that's formed her entire life, is an elderly gardener taking care of his mother. The show will emphasize that it's not as if Yan-Ra has been redeemed or anything, as he's still pretty clearly an asshole, but this dark atmosphere that Katara craves just isn't there. Well, at least it's not until she shows up. While Yan-Ra will initially try to resist, it doesn't do much in the face of Katara's anger. A giant battle against this monster who has wronged her just isn't in the cards for this video's protagonist, as she instead finds herself with an old man's life placed quite easily in her hands. In this moment, the episode has made it as clear as possible that there's no actual good that can come from Katara doing what she set out to do, as Yan-Ra's days of destroying families are far behind him. But it's also made it almost equally clear that he certainly deserves a far worse fate than this quiet life he's made for himself. Katara has found herself at an impasse, where she once found it very easy to condemn Jet and Hama for their violent responses to Fire Nation injustice. It just seems impossible for her to follow suit. Almost, anyway. Earlier in the episode, when Aang catches Katara and Zuko seconds before leaving on their trip, he has a choice to make himself. As much as Katara seems to disagree, it's hard to imagine that Aang couldn't have kept the duo from taking Appa, and yet, after one final plea for peace, he lets them go. I think he knew what she would ultimately choose to do. Katara doesn't kill Yan-Ra. She describes him as pathetic, sad, empty, proclaims that she hates him and will never forgive him for what he did, but there's no more violence in this episode. In the end, there's neither a big act of revenge nor a spiritual acceptance of the past, just Katara being left to figure out why she couldn't do what she wanted most. But even if all of her problems weren't magically solved, there is a level of peace to be found in the fact that Katara did have this interaction. There's no more wondering what she would do or how she would feel if she found this man responsible for her worst nightmare. Now there's only figuring out how to deal with it. As Zuko alludes to at the end of the episode, this won't be the final time that somebody in this show comes face to face with the representation of their grief, as ultimately the series will conclude with Aang in a very similar situation, picking a very similar option. I do think there are some bones you can pick with how The Last Airbender as a whole tackles this issue. I've never been a huge fan of how Aang is really only able to stick to nonviolence through gaining this sudden ability, but none of that will ever get in the way of how much I enjoyed this climax of Katara's story. Throughout the series, everything Katara does is quite infamously directed by what happened to her mother. Every decision made with the goal of avenging her fate, the idea that if only Katara can do that, then everything else will be okay, and it's in this moment that that dream just dies. There was never a possible happily ever after for Katara's relationship with her mother. There never was anything that could have made what happened any better. Nothing besides just trying to move on. Anyway, that's about it for me. If you somehow want even more awesome and never incorrect takes on animation, you can find me withering away on the Twitter alternative where the skies are blue. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks with a video I've been promising for quite some time. Thanks for watching.